of speaking in the congregation such a tongue as people understand. It is a thing plainly repugnant to the Word of God and the custom of the primitive church to have public prayer in the church or to minister the sacraments in a tongue not understood by the people.
Well, this is an exciting conversation to have on All Saints Sunday. Today I'm going to teach you how to speak in tongues. It's going to be awesome. No one's laughing? No? All right. As we get started, let's begin with a moment of prayer. Would you pray? God, on this day, I do ask that you would work in us in such a way that we could be present to you, even as you're here present with us. Oh, Lord God, on this day, I ask that you would take the words of my mouth, the meditations of all of our hearts, and you would work and move in such a way that they would be made to be acceptable in your sight, for indeed, you are our rock and you are our Redeemer. Amen. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, once summarized his mission in this way. He said that his goal was to proclaim plain truth for plain people. Wesley basically said that his goal was to articulate the Christian faith in such a way that the people of his time would understand it and they would find it compelling. Now, here's the thing. Wesley lived in the 1700s. Wesley lived in England of the 1700s. It was a culture and it was a world that was saturated with Christianity. It formed the ceiling and the floor and the walls of the world in which they lived, and so most people understood Christianity or some form of Christianity from the very beginning. And so when Wesley says, I'm going to proclaim plain truth for plain people, here's the catch. Pretty much everyone understood. That's not the case for our world today, though. In the U.S. culture that we live in many ways, we live in what can be described as a post-Christian world. And what I mean by that is, well, the studies are pretty clear. 30% of the population in the United States say that they attend a worship service one time per month on average. 47% of the population says that they identify as Christian. What's this mean for us? Well, it means for us that not everyone understands our language or our customs or the things that we're talking about. To use an analogy, for some people to come to a worship service, and for some people to talk about Christianity is kind of like they got on a plane, they flew to a foreign country, they got off the plane, and everyone was speaking a foreign language, and people are participating in customs that don't necessarily make sense to them. Because of this, I'm going to try something today. This is a classic Andy move. I'm going to try something today. Because of this, here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to use modern science and psychology to reinforce the claims that we believe as Christians. Now, that might seem odd because, let's be honest, in the last 100 years or so, psychology and science and theology and religion and spirituality have not always, well, we've not always got along all that well. But here's the thing. In the last 30 years, there's been some remarkable claims being made that, well, quite frankly, sounds a lot like us. For example, there are some physicists who claim that the fundamental processes of the universe happen outside of space and time. They claim that the universe is moving with intent. I'm not sure what all that means, but it kinda, maybe, a little bit, might sound like the world is a lot more complicated and, dare I say, enchanted than we first thought. Here's another one. There are some philosophers who claim that consciousness is not just relegated to human beings, that it's inherent to the reality in which we live. Now, I'm not sure what to do with all that because I'm not a philosopher, but it sounds like, in some ways, a little bit, that the universe and the world could be self-aware. Last one. I'm not a psychologist. But some claim that people who have developed a strong spiritual core, people who have developed a strong sense of spirituality, they thicken the very part of our brains that withers in seasons of depression. mix it all together. I'm no scientist. I'm no philosopher. And no, I'm not a psychologist. I'm none of those things. But mix it all together, and what do we find? Well, the world's much more enchanted. The world's much more mystical. The universe is much more interactive than what we initially thought, or have at least been taught to think. And so today what I'd like to do is just kind of real quickly, this is just fascinating stuff to me, but I want to real quickly dive into what they call themselves spiritual psychologists have begun to say as they study the impact of spirituality on our sense of well-being. And the first person I want to talk about as I talk about spiritual psychology is, drum roll, this person. Put him up. Anyone? Anyone? Looks kind of like another old white guy from 100 years ago, doesn't it? Yes. His name's William James. He is known as the father of American counseling psychology. He's the first person to teach a class on psychology in the educational world. 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago actually, 1903, William James gave a series of lectures that became a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And now what's fascinating about William James' work is he was unlike many of the psychologists and counselors and therapists of that time in that he assumed that people were telling the truth when they talked about their experiences with God. He assumed that they were not falsifying reality, they weren't making stuff up, that it was not a form of mental illness, but William James assumed that they were telling the truth when they talked about having spiritual experiences. And he wrote it down in a book and became known as The Varieties of Religious Experiences, and some people rate it as one of the most influential books of the 20th century. Here's the thing. By and large, his work was dismissed by many modern psychologists and counselors. Dismissed. In fact, his idea of religion and the experience of religion and psychology and all that stuff and how it applied to spirituality was kind of like pushed aside into like the shadow culture. And they were like, no, that can't be real. I share this, though, for this reason. From the very beginning of psychology and counseling in the secular world, from the very beginning, there are some people that saw that it could have a significant impact on the well-being, the mental health of a person. William James. We don't hear much about spiritual psychology for about 100 years or so until this person. Anyone? Anyone? No? Her name's Dr. Lisa Miller. I am a Dr. Lisa Miller groupie. She's awesome. She's a therapist, psychologist. She is a person that has been trained in the classical ways that we typically do mental health therapy. She went to Yale. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. Currently, she's the professor at Columbia, and she oversees what they call the Spirit and Mind Institute at Columbia. But in the 1990s, she began to ask a question that I think many people are asking today. And here's the question. Why are we not getting better? Why are we not getting better? She started asking that question at first to folks that were institutionalized for mental health reasons. She was using all the stuff she'd been taught, and folks would get better for a little bit, they would go out, they would come back again and again and again. So she asked the question, why are we not getting better? She then broadened that out to the broader culture. And she asked, why are we in the Western world not getting better? We are the most affluent culture, society, whatever you want to call it, that the world has ever known. We are the most technologically advanced society, culture the world has ever known. And yet, study after study is showing that our mental health is in an awful place. Depression's up, anxiety's up. There's a sense that life has no meaning and people struggle with purpose. It's like we're walking around with a big question mark. And so she asked the question, why are we not getting better? And through her studies, this is what she discovered, that cultivating a spiritual core, to use her language, cultivating a spiritual core is the greatest source of resilience that we can offer ourselves, our children, and others. Now, not everyone's going to agree with Dr. Miller. I get that. But let's just run a quick experiment right here, right now, in your own life. Imagine, put your sanctified imagination on with me. Imagine you're not alone. Imagine God is with you. Imagine there's a higher power that is guiding you, sustaining you, will not leave you, and you're not isolated, you're not alone, but at this very moment, that presence is with you here and now. Notice the difference it makes. Just run the experiment. You mean it's not all up to us? Yes, precisely. It's not all up to us. Here are 3 claims that Dr. Lisa Miller makes when it comes to spiritual psychology, mental health. Claim number 1, she says that we are born into this world innately spiritual. I know, don't hear psychologists or therapists typically talk like that, but here's how she defines spirituality. It's an inner sense of relationships to a higher power that is loving and guiding. The word we give to this higher power might be God, it could be the universe, nature, spirit. Next slide. The creator, or other words that represent a divine presence. But the important point is that spirituality encompasses our relationship and dialogue with this higher power. If you have a kid, a young child in your life, or a grandchild in your life, you've seen this enacted. Kids see the world in an enchanted way. We are born into this world where the world is enchanted to us and magical to us almost. It's much more exciting than the way we experience it as adolescents and adults, right? I mean, little kids. In their world, the tree needs a hug. The dog is like their sister. The little ants have to hurry up to get back to the homes. The sun smiles at us. This is the life of a little child. The other thing you'll notice about kids, if you got kids in your life, is that they assume most of the time that a higher power or God is real. I remember a time a few years back chatting with a friend from church, and his little son at that time, his name was Jimmy, was very young. He looked at us like we were crazy. Why are you talking about God for? Jimmy says to us. God's there, God's there, God's there, and God's there. Didn't have to be proven, it just was. The other thing about kids is a lot of times kids assume the afterlife is real as well. We don't have to argue about it, prove it, they just assume. Now what happens? Well, we get cultured out of it, don't we? We're told that that's just childish. And sometimes what also can happen is we use religion, I'm not going to get myself in trouble, but I believe this is be true. We use religion as a substitute for an actual relationship with a higher power. We're more interested in our religious language box and making sure people fit into our religious language box than experiencing the world in an enchanted way. Now, here's the thing. I'm not going to tell you to leave this place today and go hug trees or talk to birds. I'm not going to do that, okay? But what I am going to tell you is that I'm convinced that these people are on to something. And that our life, it really is a part of a bigger life that is loving and guiding and with us. We can listen to our spiritual compass, otherwise known as our hearts. We can listen to that. And there's things in our life that happen way beyond just simply a coincidence. We've trained ourselves not to see it, with devastating consequences to the way that we react to the world. Claim number 2. When it comes to spirituality, we either use it or lose it. A cultivated spirituality, again, is one of the greatest sources of resilience that we can find. Walking away from it also has consequences. Let me just go through with it versus without it real quick, according to Dr. Miller. With it, everything has inherent sacred value. Without it, our value is determined by our abilities, those things that we are good at, and success. So with it, we're all valuable. Without it, life becomes a huge competition. Second one. With it, life has a sense of guiding us. There's meaning, there's purpose, there's intent behind the universe and the world around us. Why? Because there's a sacred dimension. Without it, unsure. Last one. With it, we're always connected, never alone. Without it, isolated. In the Christian world, we call this responsible grace. Grace is not a power or a force, it's a word that we use for the loving presence of God. And responsible grace means that we can either say yes to that presence or no to that presence, and our choices make a difference in terms of how sensitive we are to God's presence within our lives. Last one, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Spirituality is 30% heredity or genetic, 70% environmental, though. We are a communal people. We pick up what the other people around us are putting out. Survival of the fittest, evolutionarily speaking, involves, here's the thing, it involves getting along and working together with other people. That's what helps us work as a species. What does that mean? Well, we pick up what the people around us are putting out. In fact, in our brains, there's these things called mirroring neurons. I know, sounds woo-woo-y. Mirroring neurons pick up what the emotions of the people around us. They pick up what the emotions are of the people around us, and we feel it in our own body even. Babies do this, and adults do this. What does this mean? Well, it means what my mama told me as a kid. We become who we hang out with. What's this mean spiritually speaking? If we as parents and grandparents don't take spirituality seriously, don't talk about it with our kids and our grandkids, then they're not going to take it seriously either. That's what it means. Spiritually speaking, the people who, through their teaching and example, who have taught us about a relationship with the higher power, God, spiritually speaking, the people who embodied the love of God to us, we call them in the Christian world saints. That's what a saint is. Someone, through their teaching and their example, they have loved us well. They've talked about their relationship with God. And through that interaction, from early on, we developed faith ourselves. In my world, the saints in my world are my kids. They remind me of an Andy that I once knew before life got heavy. They still see it in the world in enchanted ways. They still are curious and excited, and things seem magical. Quick story. A few days ago was Halloween, right? We were all ready for Halloween in my household. My daughters are 9 and 6. We were all ready. All systems go, Peyton household. And of course, as a pastor, I had to say it. Did you know that Halloween is not just a secular holiday, that it's also a religious one too? And the girls did not. They said, no, we didn't know that. Really? Yeah, I know. It's shocking, but no. Well, what's it about, Dad? Well, I'm so glad you asked. It's about remembering our loved ones who have entered into heaven. It's about remembering them. At which point Ella, my 6-year-old, says, yeah, Halloween, it's about remembering our loved ones and capturing them in our hearts. Later on, I said to Ella, "What loved ones do you want to remember this year, Ella?" And she says, "Papal Dennis." Well, Papal Dennis is my dad, and he passed away in July this last year because of cancer. She says, I want to remember Papal Dennis. And then she goes on to say, "Yeah, a few nights ago I had a dream about him even." She's like, "Yeah, dream. You don't have these?" I'm like, "No, dream." I was like, "Really?" She goes, "Yeah, Papal Dennis is in my dream." I said, "Well, what were you doing?" She says, "Playing on the playground." "Oh. Did he say anything to you?" "Yeah, he did actually." "Well, what did he say?" Ella says. "He says, 'Even though I'm not with you, I will never leave you.'" Who's the person that you want to capture in your heart today? We live in a world where it's easy to slip out of it. And by that I mean it's easy to forget about that sacred presence in our lives. It's hard sometimes, isn't it, to trust in our spiritual compass. And it's hard sometimes to believe that we really are a part of something greater. And in those moments where we struggle with it, here's what we do. We turn to the saints. We turn to the saints and we listen to their voice. And they remind us about what we most need to know. I can still hear my grandmother. I know what she would say right now. She would say, "This will be shocking to you. Andrew is going to be okay." She would say that. I can still hear my grandfather say, "Proud of you. Love you." I can still see my dad, Papal Dennis, riding with the girls on the Cub Cadet lawnmower playing. And in those moments where I struggle spiritually, I remember that. And I know that their voices, those saints in my life, those saints in your life, their voices connect me with the voice and the presence is always with us. On this All Saints' Day, with that in mind, let us turn to Holy Communion and feel their presence with us today.